In the summer of 1942, as the fires of war raged across continents, Europe remained trapped beneath the cold and crushing heel of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Nations had fallen like dominoes in a relentless campaign of blitzkrieg, and among them France, a proud republic once radiant with culture and revolutionary fervor, now lay subdued under the German jackboot. The fall of Paris in June 1940 had marked a symbolic defeat not only for the French, but for all free peoples of the world. 2 years into the occupation, the scars were not only physical, but deeply psychological. Paris, the fabled city of light, had dimmed into a city of shadows. Once echoing with laughter in its cafes and the murmur of poetry on its riverbanks, the city now echoed with the heavy march of Wehrmacht boots and the menacing growl of German military vehicles. The swastika, hideously foreign, flapped defiantly atop landmarks like the Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe, symbols once sacred to French liberty and revolution. German propaganda plastered the walls while the eyes of the Gestapo watched from behind darkened windows. The morale of the French people had been tested again and again through collaborationist Vichy rule, forced conscriptions, deportations, and the brutal silencing of resistance. Yet beneath the surface, the spirit of defiance had not been extinguished. Whispers of the Maquis, of Gaullist broadcasts from London, and of Allied victories in far-off deserts stirred embers of hope. But these embers needed oxygen, a bold gesture to fan them into flame. Inside the minds of British planners and pilots alike, there was growing awareness that a psychological blow to the occupiers, particularly one administered in the heart of occupied France, could achieve more than 1,000 bombs dropped on a remote factory. What was needed was not just military damage, but theater, symbolism powerful enough to ignite the hearts of the oppressed and shame the proud occupiers. It was in this context that an audacious idea took shape within the Royal Air Force and the Special Operations Executive. The mission would be small in scale but enormous in impact. It would combine aerial precision, raw daring, and symbolic defiance. The objective was threefold: to fly a British aircraft, ideally a twin-engine Bristol Beaufighter or de Havilland Mosquito, over the occupied capital in broad daylight, to drop the French tricolor from the skies onto the Arc de Triomphe as a visual declaration of resistance, and to strike the Gestapo headquarters with a brief but ferocious attack. This was to be no typical bombing run. It was a theatrical statement, a dagger of defiance thrust straight into the heart of Nazi-occupied France. The very thought of a lone Allied aircraft swooping over Paris, evading German fighters and flak to deliver a symbolic payload onto one of France's most revered monuments, bordered on the fantastical. But it was precisely this element of improbability that made it irresistible to those who understood the importance of psychological warfare. It was a message not only to the enemy but to the people. Paris was not forgotten. France was not abandoned. The spirit of liberty had not died beneath the swastika. Planning such a mission required surgical precision. The selected aircrew would need to be the best, men with nerves of steel, unbreakable focus, and an understanding that this was as much about morale as it was about munitions. The aircraft would have to fly low, dangerously low, to avoid radar detection and enemy flak. It would have to penetrate the enemy's defenses, execute its symbolic drop, and unleash a volley of fire upon the Gestapo headquarters, all while risking interception by Luftwaffe fighters stationed at various airfields around Paris. Success would require more than skill. It would demand daring, speed, and perhaps a dose of luck. And yet, from London to Algiers, from remote Free French outposts to resistance cells buried deep within France, the plan ignited a sense of daring that had been absent for too long. It was a mission soaked in risk, but its potential for psychological payoff was unmatched. It would strike not only the concrete of the Gestapo's stronghold, but the very mythology of Nazi invincibility. For too long, the Reich had acted with impunity across the continent. A daylight raid over the very nerve center of occupied France would be a slap to the face, a mocking grin at the overconfident occupier. Even as debates swirled within the RAF High Command, there was little doubt among the more imaginative officers that this mission could define a new chapter in Allied resistance. It would be something the people of Paris and the Nazis would not easily forget. The tricolor fluttering down from the heavens would not merely be cloth. It would be a symbol of a France that still breathed, still dreamed, and still dared to fight. And so, against the backdrop of one of the darkest chapters in Europe's history, the seeds of a daring airborne operation were sown. From the clouds above, a silent promise would be made, that France would rise again, that the oppressor's grip was not eternal, and that even in the heart of occupied Paris, the spirit of resistance could still take wing. Among the countless brave men who donned flight suits in defense of freedom during the Second World War, Flight Lieutenant Alfred Kenneth "Ken" Gatward stood out not merely for his skill, but for his daring, his willingness to embrace the seemingly impossible with steady hands and cool nerves. Born with a deep sense of duty and an affinity for flying, Gatward was already an accomplished pilot in the Royal Air Force by 1942. His reputation for handling aircraft with precision, even under intense pressure, made him a natural choice for missions that demanded more than technical expertise. They required boldness bordering on the audacious. But this mission would be different from anything he had undertaken before. It was to be as much a strike against morale as it was a tactical act, a carefully choreographed display meant to embarrass the Nazi occupiers and stir the embers of resistance among the downtrodden citizens of occupied France. To accompany him on this unprecedented operation was Sergeant Gilbert George Fern, a navigator whose calm demeanor and razor-sharp focus made him an ideal match for Gatward. The success of the mission would hinge on their seamless coordination. Timing, geography, fuel calculations, radio silence, visual navigation through hostile territory, all would fall on Fern's shoulders. He knew that one misjudgment in coordinates, one delay in course correction, or even a moment's hesitation could end with both men crashing into the streets of Paris or being torn apart by German flak. And yet, there was no hesitation in accepting the assignment. Both Gatward and Fern were men of rare resolve, and they understood the mission's stakes. It wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about demonstrating, for all the world to see, that the Allies were not cowering in the face of tyranny, that Paris was still in their hearts, that the swastika, however large and looming, could be challenged, even mocked. Their aircraft was a Bristol Beaufighter Mark WWII, one of the RAF's most potent tools in the air war. With its twin Bristol Hercules radial engines and sleek, intimidating frame, the Beaufighter was more than a match for many German fighters in the right hands. It had speed, agility, and teeth. Armed with 4 forward-firing 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, but it also had the range and ruggedness needed for long, low-level missions. In the right hands, it was a predator, and now, in Gatward's hands, it was about to become an emissary of defiance. In the early hours of June 12, 1942, Gatward and Fern prepared for takeoff from RAF Thorney Island, a coastal airfield in West Sussex. The weather had finally cleared after days of delay. Clouds parted and sunlight pierced the gloom. It was now or never. With final checks complete and hearts steady, they climbed into the cockpit and taxied down the runway. Their Beaufighter roared to life, engines growling as it lifted into the skies over southern England. They flew southeast over the English Channel, maintaining a treacherously low altitude, sometimes no higher than the rooftops of villages or the waves of the sea, to evade German radar and visual detection. Every minute of the flight was tense, the threat of interception ever present. But luck and skill kept them cloaked in silence. Crossing into occupied France was a psychological blow in itself. Beneath them were the same fields, rivers, and towns that had once been defended by the French army, now controlled by the Wehrmacht. As they flew deeper inland, Fern navigated with an uncanny sense of direction, his eyes darting between maps, instruments, and the terrain below. Gatward, hands firm on the controls, kept the aircraft low and fast, ready to make split-second decisions in case of enemy contact. And then, like a ghost rising from memory, the skyline of Paris appeared ahead of them. First the distant silhouette of the city, then the unmistakable landmarks of one of the world's great capitals. The Eiffel Tower stood like a skeletal giant, watching silently as its occupiers strutted beneath it. The Seine snaked through the city like a silver ribbon, and in the heart of it all, rising proudly amid the boulevards, stood the Arc de Triomphe, still majestic, though now defiled by the Nazi flag that fluttered atop it. This was their primary target. Gatward adjusted the throttle, dipping the Beaufighter lower still as they approached their mark. The French tricolor had been carefully folded and weighted for the drop. It was not simply a flag, it was a message, a symbol, a strike against the soul of the occupation. As they soared over the Arc de Triomphe at an impossibly low altitude, Gatward tilted the aircraft just right, and Fern released the flag. It spiraled downward in the wind, a burst of red, white, and blue against the drab backdrop of gray stone and Nazi banners. In that moment, the heart of Paris beat again. It was an act of raw symbolism, but also of psychological warfare. Cameras clicked from the sidewalks. German officers and French civilians alike looked skyward in disbelief. No alarms had sounded. No fighters had been scrambled. A lone British warplane was flying unchallenged above the capital. But the mission was far from over. With precision and cold determination, Gatward banked the aircraft toward their secondary target, the Gestapo headquarters on the Rue des Saussets, near the Place de la Madeleine. This building, a dark hub of fear and oppression, was notorious among Parisians for its interrogations and brutal reprisals. The Beaufighter swooped in like an avenging hawk. At the exact moment, Gatward opened fire. A burst of cannon shells tore through the facade of the building. Windows shattered, walls splintered, smoke and debris filled the air. The German officers inside were caught completely off guard. Civilians ducked in terror, unsure whether to fear the attackers or cheer them. The shock of the strike echoed through the city. Never before had an Allied aircraft so brazenly penetrated the German air net to deliver a message with such deadly punctuation. Even as the smoke curled into the Parisian sky, Gatward and Fern knew their window was closing. Every second increased the chance of a Luftwaffe response. But with adrenaline surging and the mission's objectives achieved, they turned westward, racing toward the safety of the coast. Though German anti-aircraft gunners had scrambled and a few scattered shots rang out, no serious damage was inflicted. Their aircraft, defiant and intact, vanished into the horizon as quickly as it had come. Timing in a mission like this was everything, not just for the sake of avoiding detection, but for the symbolism it could carry. The RAF's planners had chosen the timing with meticulous care, seeking to align the daring flyover with a German military parade scheduled to march proudly down the Champs-Élysées. The imagery was designed to be unforgettable. While the Nazis strutted through the heart of occupied Paris, a British warplane would scream above them, dropping the colors of Free France in the very face of their pompous display. It would be the ultimate insult, a declaration that the Allies could pierce even the most guarded heart of Hitler's European empire. But fate, ever unpredictable, had a different plan. Whether due to poor weather, internal scheduling changes, or sheer coincidence, the German parade never materialized. When Gatward and Fern roared into the skies above the city, the famed avenue was eerily empty. No ranks of jack-booted soldiers, no rhythmic stomping echoing off the stone facades, no flag-waving collaborators or forced cheer from local civilians. Just silence, broken only by the growing roar of the approaching Beaufighter. But where lesser men might have hesitated or turned back, Gatward and Fern pressed on, undeterred. They had come not merely to disrupt, but to deliver a message. And that message would be heard regardless of whether goose-stepping Germans were beneath them. As they approached the Arc de Triomphe, a majestic and solemn monument now defiled by the Nazi banner, Gatward dropped to rooftop level, banking slightly as he approached the target. The moment was exacting. With a skilled hand and steady nerves, Fern leaned from the cockpit and released the specially prepared French tricolor flag. The silk unfurled in the wind, its colors catching the sunlight as it descended gracefully over the monument. It was a haunting, almost surreal moment. The red, white, and blue of France fluttered once again over the Arc de Triomphe, if only briefly. Below, passers-by stopped in shock and awe. Some gasped, some cried, others dared to cheer quietly under their breath, lest German ears catch wind of their joy. That single flag did what no bullet or bomb could. It rekindled hope. It was not just a flag. It was a statement, a declaration that France was not forgotten. But the mission was far from over. With the flag delivered, Gatward adjusted course for the second objective, the Gestapo headquarters in the Place de la Concorde. This target, though smaller in scale than a parade or symbolic as the Arc, carried with it immense weight. The Gestapo was the very symbol of Nazi terror in occupied France. Its name struck fear into the hearts of even the most hardened resistance fighters. It was in this building that prisoners were tortured, plans were coordinated, and the iron grip of oppression tightened daily. Hitting it wasn't just a tactical move, it was psychological warfare at its finest. As the Beaufighter approached, Gatward pulled up slightly and then dove into a precision attack run. From the nose of the aircraft, 4 20mm Hispano cannons roared to life, sending a stream of high explosive shells toward the facade of the building. Windows exploded in a spray of glass and steel. The upper levels of the Gestapo offices were rocked with fire and debris. German personnel inside scrambled for cover, unprepared, and caught completely off guard by the sudden and unexpected assault. Civilians on the street ducked in terror, unsure if this was an accident, a raid, or something more. For Gatward and Fern, every second of the attack was a balance of risk and impact. They couldn't linger. Anti-aircraft guns could be brought to bear at any moment. Patrol fighters might scramble. Yet the damage was done, both physical and psychological. The Gestapo had been humiliated, their fortress scarred by the very force they claimed to control. The message was clear. Even their walls were not safe. Even in Paris, they could be reached. Smoke and debris trailed behind them as Gatward pulled away from the attack run, banking hard to the west. Their altitude remained dangerously low, hugging the rooftops and treetops as they made their exit. The Beaufighter's engines thundered, but its silhouette vanished swiftly over the rooftops of Paris, disappearing into the countryside before any organized resistance could respond. Behind them, the city stirred, shell-shocked, confused, and invigorated. The impact of the raid was instantaneous. The sight of the French flag floating down from a British aircraft, the brazen strike on one of the most feared symbols of Nazi rule. It stirred conversation, whispers, and quiet cheers in the streets. It was a break in the clouds of oppression, a glimpse of the coming liberation. As they flew over the French countryside, retracing their route across enemy lines and back toward the Channel, Gatward and Fern remained alert. Though their mission was behind them, the skies were still full of danger. One slip, one interception by a Luftwaffe patrol, or a lucky flak burst could end it all. They flew fast, low, and focused. The English coast, when it finally came into view, was a welcome sight. Green fields and familiar landscapes bathed in evening light. Their Beaufighter crossed the shoreline with engines humming steadily, weathered but intact. Upon landing at RAF Thorney Island, the pair were greeted with stunned silence that quickly gave way to raucous celebration. Word spread quickly. Photographs of the mission's results began to circulate. The flag drop, the damaged Gestapo headquarters, the daring flight through the heart of occupied territory. Gatward and Fern were hailed as heroes, though both carried themselves with the humility of men who had done their duty, not for glory, but for cause. The RAF publicly praised the mission, emphasizing its strategic and moral significance. British newspapers published sketches and descriptions, while underground French publications carried stories of the raid with pride. Even neutral countries took notice. It was a bold move in a war of attrition, a psychological strike that rippled through occupied Europe. For the Germans, it was a moment of embarrassment. Questions were raised about the failure of air defenses, the inability of the Luftwaffe to protect the capital, and the growing audacity of Allied forces. The Nazi propaganda machine tried to minimize the event, labeling it as a reckless act by rogue airmen. But the damage was done, not only to buildings, but to prestige. The raid exposed cracks in their armor, proof that the Third Reich was not as invincible as it claimed. And for the French, both occupied and free, the mission was a breath of life. It reminded them that beyond the barbed wire and patrols, beyond the curfews and ration cards, beyond the fear, someone was fighting for them. Someone remembered Paris, the tricolor still flew, and freedom, though distant, was drawing near.